it's hard to know what's of interest to people.
Yeah. And there's a lot more footage coming available. I mean, last week it was very modest and moderate footage.
Yeah.
Out.
Yeah, tons just keeps coming available. I was just saying to Elizabeth and the crew here that we today just got access to another 1,000 videos that we're now downloading and geocoding and time stamping and synchronizing up and all of that kind of stuff. So there's an incredible body of material documenting the whole thing, and that's part of the value, I think, of the sort of the work that we do, is to try to clear away the fog of chaos around these types of events and try to make them a little bit more explanatory, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we'll start then with that, if you don't mind. Malachy, welcome, and thank you very much for coming. We are jumping back into a conversation in a way, but Malachy joins us tonight from New York, where he is working with you know, as you just said there, lately on the story last week, the insurrection at the Capitol. But he basically works with eyewitness media and community engagement, and it's an investigative reporting technique that kind of gleans together digital and video resources. He's part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team from the New York Times, who won an award for their coverage on Russia, on a story about Russia last year. So we'll talk to him about that. And of course, he's done huge work too on Breonna Taylor and Black Lives Matter. You may remember the Breonna Taylor case, the police did not have body cams on. And so we'll talk to Malachy about, you know, how much of the story that they had to kind of recreate or create, you know, from kind of nothing. So Malachy, you know, as part, of course, of the Irish American Heritage Museum, our mission is to talk about people's experiences and their ties with home, their culture. So we'll start with those basic questions, you know, where are you from in Ireland and what brought you to America?
Yeah, I'm from Broadford, County Limerick, and what brought me to America was an opportunity to work at the Times. I was working for immediately prior to that for an American startup, although I was the only member of staff in Ireland. I was working in Dublin at the time, and then it was a tiny team, only 7 of us, 4 in the States, 3 in the US, 3 in Europe, and it was a kind of an experimental startup that used social media both to sort of draw information about breaking news stories, but you know, investigations as well, and then use social media to also put it back out there. It was a small team called Reportedly, and prior to that, I was with another startup in Ireland called Storyful, and that used similar techniques to, you know, this was in 2010, so it was, you know, just as the Arab Spring was starting, and you know, we were, you know, trying to figure out how to make use of social media. It was kind of clear to us, and the founder's vision for this was, he was getting information in 2009 during the Green Revolution in Iran faster than the international networks were presenting it. And it was Mark Little. People might recognize Mark Little's name. He was one of the hosts of Primetime and foreign correspondent with RTE, Washington correspondent for several years. Anyway, he left RTE and he set up this ragtag group that was, you know, basically making it up as we went along. But we did put in place sort of like really good systems to monitor, but also then to verify information as it was breaking on social media. And then in turn, turn that into a news agency where you're kind of selling this layer of trust, this kind of fact checking of the information to bigger newsrooms that didn't yet have that capability, like the Times, Channel 4, ABC. They were all early clients. And then Google came along and said, you know, a lot of our Spring material is surfacing on YouTube. Could you help us organize that on YouTube's news channel as well? And so they became a client and an important sort of backer as well to kind of see us through those early years as a group. And so that, you know, before that, I worked with an uncle of mine, Vincent Browne, who had a magazine in Ireland and gave me an apprenticeship in return for building a website for him, because prior to that I came from computer programming background, and so yeah, so that was my journey to New York.
Well, so that's interesting. Like journalism was kind of in the blood, even though you had gone down another road initially.
Yeah, I suppose you'd be exposed to it, all right. And I was living with Vincent through college and for a couple of years afterwards and stuff like that. So I was paying attention to what he was doing, you know, when he was working at the Tribune and the Irish Times. I remember actually going into the Sunday Tribune in my first year of college, photocopying my friends' notes using their photocopiers. So in and out.
Oh my God, that was a great advantage.
Yeah.
And so the New York Times went from being kind of a client to hiring you on staff then?
Yes, yeah, they around 2014-15 they had done a thing called they wrote an internal report called the Innovation Report, and they were trying to figure out what their standing was in relation to other digital businesses like BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, all the traditional ones as well. But there were lots of kind of startups that were you know really understood, I think, digital media better than some of the legacy outlets, and so they did that. And then as a result of that, I think they were looking for people from non-traditional backgrounds, and hey presto, sort of a chat ended up with an interview, ended up with a test, and then a job. So
wow. Isn't that interesting that well, maybe it is kind of inevitable in a way that the traditional media were slower to adopt that kind of technological, you know, aspect or the social media side of things. You know, were they woefully unprepared? Like,
I think that, you know, certainly in Storyful, what we found when we were kind of going around newsroom to newsroom, kind of selling our wares, if you like, social media was kind of like in inverted commas, and it was like, oh, the social media person is that person over there in the corner who's responsible for putting our journalism out onto social media, instead of thinking of it as like a really rich source of information that we could incorporate into our news and use as part of investigations. I think it depended on the journalist and it depended on the teams, but certainly institutionally, it didn't seem that was a priority for leadership in a lot of places that we went to. And so, but that changed, and I think it changed in a number of ways when some newsrooms cottoned onto it and they started doing good work. And then also as more political figures and the likes of Kieran and those types of people ended up on social media, you know, it became more of a public forum, and it was a place where newsrooms had to listen, and that's where news broke very, very often.
Well, I think, and you mentioned the Arab Spring, I do remember even like hearing the words kind of for the first time on news programs like that. We're seeing this happen, you know, through people tweeting or Facebooking or, you know, saying I'm out here. So it was, you know, kind of the first big mass use of it to pass on information, you know, particularly in a vaguely censored society, you know.
Yeah.
So you can see how it gets bigger. Now that kind of brings us into, you know, where we are today in terms of like fake news and all of these accusations about the media. Like, do you think the proliferation of digital and social media, even though it has been very good in, as you said, like it's, you know, a generator of news, but has it also kind of undermined our trust in that, you know, I said it earlier on, I didn't fact check something that I read on Twitter, you know, and so, you know, this is a double-edged sword that you're dealing with probably.
At this stage, most definitely. I think it's a fairly fundamental societal problem. And it, you know, there's all sorts of reasons for that, lack of regulation of the platforms, the way in which their algorithms work as well, which, you know, is for, you know, to keep you on their platforms as much as possible and against other platforms, and to reward emotional responses on those platforms as well. And so it was all of their engineering was geared towards deeper engagement. And, you know, everybody has heard about sort of echo chambers and that kind of stuff, and filter bubbles. And, you know, that is what has happened. And also, I think, you know, they thought of their role as really just places where people could connect and share information, and it didn't matter what the quality of that information was. And suddenly you're in an environment where a year-long investigation by 5 New York Times and journalists is treated with the same sort of level, or treated at the same level or the same type of information as something that's not like that. That's maybe somebody in a basement in Slovenia who's putting out articles for clicks or making stuff up, and so there was a virality to that sort of stuff where people felt they could game the systems, and they did. And I think there was another thing as well in that, in the rush to secure money and to maximize the advertising power of these platforms, they built basically sociographic profiles of every user and sold that to the highest bidder, and that included political advertising. And so the ability for politicians and for parties to tailor their adverts to specific personal traits of people, I think has been a major shift in politics in the last 2 cycles. And there's a lot of evidence of that. I think the Trump campaign in 2016 created 6 million different ads on Facebook, and were targeting those to people who lived on certain streets because they got access to Cambridge Analytica information about people's preferences and things that triggered them, and whether they were susceptible to messages. And they combined that with all sorts of other voter registration data as well, and really were able to profile people to the extent that voter turnout in places that they targeted to try to suppress a vote was quite effective.
And like the kind of scary thing and sad thing about this is a lot of people either don't understand that or don't believe, that it happens. Like part of me doesn't mind in a way being in a silo like that. If I read the New York Times, I'm going to get recommendations from the Guardian or the Washington Post. Part of me doesn't mind that. The ads bother me. Like that if I have a conversation with somebody, the shoes pop up in the ad and they're there then for a month until you talk about something else or you Google something else. That drives me cracked. But I do think that's very insidious. Like that's a kind of a dangerous thing where they can tailor, like maybe I'm pro something because I'm pro Second Amendment, but somebody else could be pro the same thing for a different reason. And so they can target, different ads. And I don't think people understood how many of these things are bots. Like it's one thing to think you're following a person, but if it's generated by, a bot in Slovenia or Russia, that you have to question that motive, there.
Yeah, completely. I mean, the ability to I don't know, to tweak these platforms and to abuse them is right. Yeah.
And then, I mean, we were kind of skipping ahead in one sense, but, let's just talk briefly, if you want to, about, whether or not it was correct, or harmful to ban, for instance, the likes of, Trump from Twitter, or, should they be doing that? Are they kind of giving him a bigger platform in one sense, or what happened to, and, the answer is it's not actually covered by freedom of speech. I get that, but, even taking the likes of Parler and stuff offline where, maybe there was not as much regulation in the types of speech that could go up there. But how do we feel about that as a society, in terms of censorship?
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I to be honest with you, I haven't really been paying too much attention to that for the last 5 days. I think there's a risk of censorship there, of course. I don't know. I don't feel informed enough about what has happened over the last few days, probably to give you a proper answer. But I'd like to hear what other people think.
Yeah, well, maybe we can discuss that at the end. I think it's a slippy one. I think a private business can do whatever they want, obviously, and so you can refuse to bake a cake for someone, or you can take them off your platform. So I don't agree as such that it's censorship, but yeah, and this is the problem. Like, we have to maybe go back to education, because we have to train people to know the difference between fact and opinion, and or to evaluate an argument, and so that's a kind of a bigger question than just social media is responsible for. So I'm going to make you host for a second, and will you talk us through your Russian, or your investigation into the Russian, which earned you the Pulitzer Prize? So let me just make you host.
Give me a minute to pull that up there now.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody was asking, Mary,
I saw that, yeah.
was asking about the fake news prevalent in Ireland and that phenomenon. I think there are elements of it, definitely, but usually, I think it's combined over here with, one thing that strikes me. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong here, but that people's political opinions can vary very much depending on the media that they're consuming here. And I think there's probably a little bit less division in that respect, and it's partly due to regulation and at home.
Yeah, we've less fringes on either side, on either extreme.
I think so. I think some of it is kind of reinforced a little bit by that sort of divide. Whatever you agree with it, respective. But anyway.
Yeah.
How do I do this? Oh, sorry. I need to present.
So you share screen, I think. Did I make you the host? Yeah.
Okay. Screen. I'm going to share.
I'll let you concentrate. There you go. Yeah.
See that?
Perfect. We do.
Okie doke. Should be.
So will you tell us what the story exactly was?
Yeah, I mean, this was it was a very focused 9 month, actually almost a year, because it ran into this year, 2020 as well. Investigation into the phenomenon of healthcare being attacked in Syria, and it started with that. But actually, I was looking at my notes recently, and we began this way back in 2017. When I remember when this team just started and there was only a couple of us on it, and we saw that during one military campaign in Syria that a hospital or a clinic or a sort of a supply center or an ambulance was bombed once every 29 hours over a 5-week period, and it seemed to be a deliberate strategy by Syria and their military partners in Russia to sort of crush civilian life in these areas and get the areas to surrender. And then they move in the ground troops and to absolutely pummel them. And the shocking thing was that a lot of these sites were on no strike lists. So the hospitals and schools and various other civilian facilities would offer the UN their coordinates, and the UN would distribute those to the warring parties and say these are off limits. And these are understood as being some of the oldest laws of war. And it got so bad in Syria, but also in Yemen and Afghanistan and other countries, that the UN called a session to reinforce the Geneva Conventions about the protection of healthcare during conflict. And what was striking to us was, while those follow-on meetings about, establishing sort of seven steps to ensure that this was going to happen, while all of that sort of those political negotiations were going on, a maternity hospital was being bombed, a cholera center in Yemen was being bombed, a general hospital in the north of Yemen was bombed. And so we started to investigate these, and we did, our first piece was on attacks in Yemen, and we interviewed a member of the State Department who was in the room with the Saudi forces, trying to get them to reduce civilian harm and to be better behaved in using American weaponry. And we also had a team in Yemen that went and investigated 2 of these attacks as well. And while we were doing that, and just as we were publishing, there was a new offensive took off in Syria, and the same pattern was repeating itself. And so we said, okay, we're really going to go deep on this time. And that was in May 2019. And so we started investigating, dusted off some of our old files and started investigating these new attacks and documenting one by one in these spreadsheets that you'll see in a moment. And so that was the kind of the backdrop to it. Of course, a big question we had was, well, who's carrying them out? Of course, the rebel groups that are on the ground are certainly no angels. They're terrorist groups, and they terrorize local populations as well. In certain parts of Syria, less so in other parts of Syria. and they've been responsible for attacks on hospitals too. In fact, in Idlib, in one part of Idlib, they turned up at the hospital, demanded that the hospital give over supplies, and the hospital refused to do so. And there was a car bomb outside that hospital, sometime later. But we were interested in that, but we were focusing on the vast, overwhelming number of attacks that were being carried out by airstrikes, and Syria and Russia control the air, and so it was one of those two forces. That was basically the backdrop to it. And by the way, on New York Times, little plug on New York Times /visual-investigations, or if you just Google New York Times visual investigations, you get all of our work. But there's a sort of a collection of this particular body of work, which extended far beyond what I'll show here. There's the link. But just some of the stories are investigations into specific attacks, but also it carried on when we got access to files about how before the airstrikes, how doctors were being singled out and medics were being singled out, arrested, interrogated, tortured for their work in field clinics, where a lot of, in the early days of the rebellion, people would go to, when they were injured in protests and what have you. And then we carried on with, the result of this military campaign that we investigated in 2019 was a mass exodus of, I think it was close to 1 million by the end, people who fled their homes, and we documented that. And then we also went into Syria to show how even as people were fleeing, the IDP camps that they were in were also being attacked, and the farms and the schools that they were sheltering in as they went continued to be bombed. It started with basically, investigating specific attacks and using spreadsheets to document every video. You can see video links on the left-hand side for attacks on specific dates on specific hospitals. There's 4 different hospitals here. Kafr Nabil has been bombed 7 times. And then just, collecting data from, lots of people who are documenting this, UN bodies, WHO, Physicians for Human Rights in New York, and assembling all of that data, interviewing people who are in the hospitals as well, and getting their incident reports, and compiling all of this into multiple spreadsheets, and then coming up with a master database of these attacks that allow us to put in the date and the time, and I'll get back to the time, which is important in a bit, the facility, and each of these are links out to case files that we have on each one of these attacks and these hospitals. Arabic supporting organization, deconflicted, whether it was part of the UN system, protection system, and it was hard for us to do that. The UN wouldn't release those that information, but as we interviewed managers in hospital by hospital, they said, yeah, we're part of the UN. So we came up with our own list of UN hospitals. And of the 72 hospitals in 2019 that were bombed, at least 29 of them were on the UN's list. And so we're collecting all of this really granular data, and then some other information over here. And as we're doing that, this is kind of a Google Earth. I know it's a bit of a mess, but this is on Google Earth. You can lay out all different, collections or categories of evidence, from videos to photographs to reports to the precise location to satellite imagery that we're collecting as well of, the craters of the bombs in the aftermath, before and after satellite imagery. But a big part of this investigation came when we got access to these radio recordings of the pilots as they are carrying out their missions. And they're talking to ground control, exchanging coordinates, getting confirmation to go ahead with their attack, and all of this. And so we could listen in. There's a kind of a warning system already in Syria, where there's a network of observers that are listening into these open frequencies, just like police scanner audio here in the States. And they're warning each other, they're logging what they're hearing into a database, and hospitals get alerts on Twitter or on different phone apps that they have. And they also have people on the roofs of buildings, and they're like monitoring aircraft taking off from airports and where they're flying and all the rest of it. So we also got access to all of that information as well. These thousands and thousands of lines of observations, manual observations. But what they also did is they started recording those open radio transmissions. There's a website in the US called Broadcastify that does that for police scanner audio and ambulance audio radio recordings all across the US. They weren't publishing these on a website, but we found out who was recording them, got in touch with them, and then we got access to a trove of months and months of these pilot conversations, both the Syrian and the Russian ones. And so here's just an example of one of them. So pilot 948 to Fuse is the code name, is getting the coordinates. The coordinates point to this hospital that was relocated out of the town because it was bombed so many times, and they dug an underground hospital, and they had got the warning that the Russian aircraft was heading in their direction, and so they got out of there and trained their cameras on it and filmed the attack. This is Kafarnavel. Is this Kafarnavel? I think this is Kafarnavel. Yeah, it is. Being attacked, and so these are all of the code words that we were translating and coming to understand the pattern leading up to every attack that allowed us to determine when they had launched their weapons. And they used words like worked it or sent candy, or there was another one, puck, sent puck. There was another term, I can't remember it now, it's so long ago, but we spent months, we brought in, we had 3 Russian translators on the team. And in these Russian recordings, I'll show you them in a minute, but they were line by line, there were thousands of lines, they were each about 5 or 10 seconds long. So we had to translate, every single line leading up to an attack. And we had to kind of create this workflow where we would, for an entire day, download all of the audio files, put them into a spreadsheet, and then line by line go through every like 5 to 10 second chunk, translate it. And we figured out most of them are really short conversations over and back, but when they're reading coordinates, that's the same length of audio every time. And so when we looked at the audio waveform, we realized that's a pattern that we could very quickly identify. And so we got our video editors to string out all of the audio while our translators are doing their work, string everything out and like quickly scan through all of the coordinates. And so we were able to log the coordinates really quickly and examine what was happening. So we know what's going on in the skies. We know what time they're launching weapons. The challenge for us became finding out the time of the attacks on the ground. And if we could relate one to the other, then we knew we were golden. We could assign blame to Russian pilot 948 for bombing Kafarnavel because he's receiving coordinates in the area at that time, and he bombs it 3 times in a row, and there's nobody else bombing in that time period. And so some of the hospitals had CCTV, like this is Kafarnavel, you can see the camera inside there. And so we have the second, according to their camera, that the building was rattled by weapons. And in the audio, we had a couple of minutes later, pilot 31 worked it, pilot 31 worked it, pilot 31 worked it, and he's spotted in the area around Kafarnavel. So what explains the time difference? We were less concerned with that because the interval between each of these is exactly the same. And what we figured out was the CCTV system was behind by a couple of minutes. 2 different clock systems, just like your alarm clock on your bedside could be off by a couple of minutes, or fast, if you're like my mom, puts it 15 minutes ahead of everything to make sure we're on time. There's just a discrepancy, and the intervals are what nailed it. But also we picked up videos from 2 other witnesses. They ran when they heard the aircraft coming in, but they picked up the second and the third attacks on their cell phone, and they're posting those to Twitter and Facebook. And that's what you call open sourcing and all the rest of it. But what we're doing is turning open sources into primary sources who we get in touch with, talk to on secure channels, get the media directly from their devices, because that's imprinted with the hour, minute, and second that they recorded that video. And both of those videos from 2 different witnesses also lined up with this as well. So you've got 4 different reference points, as well as talking to the witnesses who are there, 5, 6 different reference points. So it's kind of like, who's your second source, who's your third source? This is like hard factual data embedded into the media that allows us to sort of triangulate it all and figure out who's bombing in that minute. And so that's what we did repeatedly through this investigation, to assign blame to certain people. At the same time, you've got the aircraft attacking Cafarnavel sighted overhead. So this is a glimpse at one of the spreadsheets. You can see we've got multiple spreadsheets on the left-hand side here, and each one of the spreadsheets goes for pages and pages and pages like this. So we're pulling out the coordinates. We figured out, there's a code for the pilot and the ground control, and here we're seeing pilot 52 talking to Titan, and sometimes it's Fuse is the ground controller. They all have code names. They also have code names for the areas in Syria that they were flying in. And we got in touch with a defected Syrian pilot, former Soviet pilot as well, to also break down and understand the code words that they're using here, which really helped us, and to kind of vet the assumptions that we're making as we listen to them, and spotting the patterns in their communications. So here you see it all. Right course 280, accepted 280, the distance is 98, correction is norm, allowed on combat, allowed by Fuse. And so they'll say the minute that they're going to attack their target, and usually they're spot on that minute. And that minute, confirms that the date and time that we have for this is correct as well. And those minutes almost always line up with the media that we're collecting for those attacks. And there's other stuff that we're doing as well, like, often you'll have plane spotters or, people who are documenting the attacks will flash up and catch the aircraft. And we know from the type of camouflage, the alignment of the wings, the model of the aircraft, what the capabilities are of the Russians versus the Syrians. So that's some analysis that we do. And that's not just us. We know that because, we study their air forces, but we also talk to maybe 10 or 12 people who are experts in this in government agencies, but also, various different nonprofits who study the Russian and Syrian Air Force, as well as those pilots that I mentioned. And then before and after satellite imagery also helps us confirm certain details as well about the level, the extent of damage, whether they were precision attacks or not, and all that kind of stuff. The type of weaponry that they're using, whether it's delayed fuse, again, precision weapons, whether they're dropping one precision strike, circling, doing the same again, or they're flying by and dropping a load of bombs at the same time in a sort of scattershot way, gives us clues about, who's responsible as well when we slow down this footage and go through it frame by frame. And then the witnesses, and because they're all connected, they're talking to each other. So this is a doctor in a hospital that's being bombed while he's underground in the hospital with patients, sending a message back to their security detail or to doctors in another hospital saying, we're under attack. And so capturing those messages in the moment is that they're sending as they're being attacked is another timestamp that allows us to validate all of the information that we're collecting, as well as interviews with, the ones I've got blacked out on the bottom right are medics who are working in those places, and the heads of different organizations, and going over to the UN and confronting the Syrian ambassador with findings. And of course he was like Teflon, just wouldn't accept anything. So, after hospitals, we started looking at some of the worst civilian attacks. And to give you an example, one of them was on this IDP camp outside of a town called Haas. This is a place where families displaced by, the conflict were living or had moved to. And it was nowhere near the front lines, as you saw. It's completely remote, no military target here. And there was one photograph. There were plenty of videos afterwards, but we wanted the moment of the attack. And there was one photograph, and this is what we're doing, what we call geolocation, making sure that the photograph is indeed Haas, and we're comparing it with footage that we know was taken in the area, prior footage, and that the smoke is indeed coming from that camp. And what you're doing is you're matching details in both sides of the footage, in reference footage and that photograph. And then there's details within the video afterwards. We knew it was close to sunset, but this video taken immediately afterwards, you can see the sun setting, and you can see the power of the blast in leveling the buildings, and also the size of the crater gives us some information that allows us to calculate the size of the weapon that was dropped. And again, it's lining up all of the data to figure out what pilot was operating in that area and launched a weapon at 7:17 when we know the attack happened. And you're also looking at sun calculators to make sure that the sun hasn't already gone down and stuff like that. And all of that is available on the web. So that's kind of it. There's a whole, this is how it looks. We produce these as videos, but then this is more and more we've been printing videos, if you like, and the designers love having that visual material to work with. And this is an example of one of those stories and what it looks like. Some of the other stories that we did over the course of it. This is a tap through that showed the extent of people fleeing, more people than the Rohingya crisis, a couple of years ago, and just what that looks like. And this wasn't a video, although it's video content, it was more of a tap through of photographs, maps, graphics, and really just explaining the flow of people and how they're now trapped up against the Turkish border. And we use satellite imagery to show the growth of the camps of tents along that border, where there's 1 million people living. So and then this is getting on the ground and documenting some of the attacks that I talked about earlier on. So that's kind of a flavor of the work that we're doing and that particular series. Any questions?
Well, so I was going to say that's amazing, Malachy. Sean has asked, he's from the consulate as well, how does the team decide which of the many atrocities happening around the world to look into? Why Syria over Congo, for example? And do you need to make a pitch, or are there situations you would like to investigate in the future that you can speak about?
Yeah, fantastic question. I mean, it's something that we grapple with every week because there's any number of stories that come across our desk. I think the thing that we look for, Sean, is, obviously is it visual, because our team is called Visual Investigations, and will our take on this, or will our work on this be original? Will it advance the story through revelations? Will there be revelations on it? And then I think impact is a big thing for us. Because we're a small team, we could cover any number of stories, but how is this, what impact will this have? And that will sometimes direct the reporting. So for instance, in the Syria stuff, we were planning to produce this really explanatory, powerful documentary about how this was happening as a phenomenon. And our editor, Mark Scheffler, said, look, is there anything in this footage that allows us to assign blame to a particular group? And so we went back, re-interviewed people, found out that they had snippets of audio recordings, and then found out that somebody was systematically recording it. And that was a total game changer. on that particular story because we wanted to have impact. With the Congo and Central African Republic, we've tried. The Congo, we've actually tried a couple of stories, didn't really get very far with them. Central African Republic, the same. You really need to sort of get on the ground there, and we've got limited capacity to do that. Although one of our colleagues, Dion Sarsi, who shared the Pulitzer with us, went into the Central African Republic, blindfolded, brought to a warlord, interviewed at gunpoint, and that was part of one of those stories. It was about Russian mercenaries, and so the whole package that won the Pulitzer was about Russian malfeasance in around the world. So that's the kind of stuff that you need to do. It's not that it's off limits for us. We do go into the field, but we try to work with a lot of visual material as a starting point, and that can be difficult. I think a lot of our team is also driven by. It's not that stories in the Congo aren't about accountability; they are, but accountability and finding wrongdoing and explaining that, and holding power to account through evidence and through finding different ways into the story, and ultimately kind of presenting the truth about these stories and what's happening. But last year we did a lot of work on, usually our stories are international stories. Last year we did a lot of work on domestic stories, on policing and the protests and that kind of stuff.
Will you take us through a little bit of your work on the Breonna Taylor, for instance, or any of those
Breonna,
stories?
I could, yeah. Breonna was an interesting one.
I'll share the screen again, or I'll make you host again.
Okay, yeah, grand.
But you don't have to, spend ages on it.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief.
Well, just because I would like to talk about the capital too. So.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let me just see.
But I think this is an important story.
Yeah, the thing about Breonna is obviously it's a really tragic story, but it was. Share my sound as well. How about that? 1 second. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Cool. Can you see the screen?
We can.
Okay. I thought I killed the application there, but.
Do not walk by yourself.
Can you hear this?
We can.
This is our city. This is our town.
For months in Kentucky, residents outraged by the killing of Breonna Taylor campaigned for the police officers who shot her to face charges.
Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Brett Hankison.
In September, a grand jury investigation indicted one officer for shooting into a neighbouring apartment, and no one for killing Taylor.
Is that the decision of the grand jury? I will grant the motion and assign bond in the amount of $15,000 full cash and issue a warrant.
Is that it? Is that the only trophy? What about the other? It can't be good. It can't be good.
No one has been held accountable. This is injustice, and this is the start clock for the next level of our protest.
What happened in the final minutes of Breonna Taylor's life? A full telling of that story has been impeded because none of the 7 police officers who raided her apartment used body cameras, a violation of police policy. But with the recent release of thousands of documents and images collected during 3 investigations, the Times initiated a fresh examination of the case. We used crime scene photos to create a precise model of Taylor's apartment. We forensically mapped out and retraced the first bullet fired by Taylor's boyfriend and the 32 bullets that police shot in return, through windows, walls and ceilings. Using interviews officers gave to investigators, we charted their movements as they carried out the raid. And we analysed hours of 911 calls, grand jury proceedings, and footage by the SWAT team that arrived after the shooting. Members of the grand jury have accused...
So can you hear me? Yeah. So I hope you heard that clearly enough. So obviously this investigation, and in fact the public's awareness about it for months, was compromised by the fact that the police didn't have body cams, and they should have. Actually, two of them did. The other 5 didn't, but they didn't turn them on. And in investigating this, we found that the raid on her house was compromised really from the beginning. The target was her ex-boyfriend, who was a drug dealer who lived over here, was a known drug dealer, had been in and out of prison, and she had an on and off relationship with him. And he was using her address while he was in prison for his bank records and phone records. So the police had a valid reason to go there. But the SWAT team had told them that they shouldn't go there, and simultaneous warrants are bad business. They shouldn't. The SWAT team was raiding his house at the time. They assembled, nonetheless, a ragtag team of officers who didn't have the right intel on her. They thought that she lived alone. She was a soft target. Didn't know that her sister lived there, that her goddaughter stayed over, that she had a new boyfriend who was staying with her. There was somebody out there who had eyes on the apartment that night, didn't see her come home with her boyfriend. And they just really hastily went around about this raid. And what we did was, using the bullet trajectories that you saw, it was me and an architect and Natalie Renault, who's the video editor, produced the stories. We were working on it since September, to model it, to use the testimony of the police in their own words, and the testimony of the fellow inside, and also the crime scene evidence, to really sort of model what happened and what's going on, and to just really lay it out, how dark it was, how enclosed, how bunched they were around this doorway. Nobody was taking cover, and kind of, show the distractions they had when a neighbor happened to come out with his little girl he was picking up after he finished the late shift at work, and really put it into
squabble with Detective Brett Hankerson and
their own words.
And already the team seems on edge.
I remember Brett extending his gun, saying, "Get back in your apartment, get back in your apartment." Brett was a little bit worked up. I remember looking at Brett saying, "Brett, relax. Brett, just relax, relax."
The man retreats inside.
So this is the police in their own words. So we're trying to visualize what happened, how it went down, and what they're thinking inside, what they're hearing. She's asleep.
Too. Like, who is that?
Banged on the door, no response. Banged on it again, no response. At that point, we started announcing ourselves.
So an issue here is that the police didn't really announce themselves clearly enough, or at all, in the early stages of this. And under Kentucky law, you have stand your ground laws, and these guys, not expecting that the police would be coming to them at all, or like, who the hell is that coming to us at 20 to 1 in the morning? He grabs his handgun. They're rushing to get dressed, and when they come out here, that's when the door comes off the hinges, and he fires a shot low to try to detract whoever's coming through the door, hits one of the police officers, and then all hell breaks loose. So I'll just play this bit.
And I hit it. After the third hit, it flew open, and that's when it hit the fan.
As we're coming to the door like comes off the hinges like an explosion.
The officers now make a tactical mistake. Mattingly steps into the doorway and puts himself in what police describe as the fatal funnel.
So the SWAT team who came out then said, God, those guys should never have done it like that. There's a fellow with a shield who's right beside him. Why doesn't he go in? First of all, you're supposed to stand behind the doorways and give plenty of time to say, hey, it's police, come on out. These guys go straight in to the apartment and into the apartment, and they know it. They already know that it's completely black, dark, because they've been sitting outside it, and they've noticed that no lights have gone on or off for the last hour or so. And the only light is behind the cops. So the cops are coming in without their flashlights, silhouetted into the doorway.
A position vulnerable to gunfire.
And so anyway, we basically, you can check it out on the website, but
Taylor,
we're showing how one of the police, he returns fire in a fairly controlled way, then takes cover, but the other guy comes in and just sprays the place until his weapon stops him.
Taylor is shot 6 times on both sides of her body, in the abdomen.
And then one of the officers goes around the front.
2 bullets fly over Walker and Taylor.
So the trajectories and where the casings were found and all of that kind of stuff helps us map out his movements, and that he fired, even though the curtains were drawn, through these apartments, through these windows. And this is what it sort of looks like inside.
And smash her clock. 3 penetrate the wall and enter her neighbour's apartment. Those bullets also smash the kitchen table, hit a wall, and shatter the patio doors at the rear. A pregnant woman, her son and partner were home. Hankinson has been charged with wantonly endangering.
So they shot into the apartment upstairs, into the apartment behind her as well. And so anyway, that's
afterwards. Interviews with the.
That's kind of it. And then we, the reason that we know that they didn't announce clearly is that we went through all of the police interviews and the 911 calls that the neighbors made. And what was striking to me was how close they were to her door. And all the police say that they clearly announced themselves inside this doorway, that they were hollering and yelling, and people were up, they had their windows open, they were watching TV, there was a guy outside having a cigarette, and they didn't hear anything. And when you show that in close proximity to her apartment, which is on the ground floor, that really raises a question about how they carried out the raid. And there's other stuff then, the chaos afterwards, the SWAT team across town, they have no idea what's going on, how they brought out the boyfriend, how she didn't receive medical attention for 30 minutes. And then there's really some sort of like horror, chilling scenes by from the SWAT team inside afterwards. They realize that she's an EMT and they're looking at the scene and they're going, oh God, this is bad. And then there's an interview with the SWAT commander who really is quite damning. So that's, sorry, I talked longer than I should have, but anyway.
No, that's great. Well, I mean, it's desperately sad. Am I right, Malachy, in thinking nobody was held accountable, like they all got off, more or less?
No, what's interesting is the day after we published early Monday morning and then Tuesday afternoon, that police officer that I mentioned who sprayed the place, he received a letter of termination. We believe that was in the works already, but I don't know. We don't know if this story had any effect, because the Courier Journal and Vice News, they had been incrementally doing a lot of really great work covering this story. And the officer, I mentioned the failed intelligence, he actually lied in the warrant, seeking the warrant for Taylor's versus the other ones, the other addresses. And he also received a notice of termination, and they've both since been fired. They were fired last week. And then Hankinson was fired as well. He's the guy who ran around the front and fired through the windows. He was fired back in June. But the Attorney General...
charges, no criminal charges to anyone?
There are charges against him, 3 charges of wantonly endangering the neighbours behind. I don't know if criminal charges will be brought against Cosgrove, who was the guy who fired through the doorway. But interesting case.
Yeah. And so that brings us up. We won't keep you on much longer now, but can you talk to us about what you're doing on last week? I presume you're up the walls.
We're up the walls, but we're, it's a good starting point for us to have all of the material that people filmed, kind of incriminating themselves, if you like, it's quite alarming the more you see it and the more you see the planning and the funding and all the rest of it. And it's quite interesting as well to me, just kind of, touching on something I said earlier on about, I think people were filming because, they really felt that they were not really breaking any laws, that this was a valid sort of revolution, that this was a warranted insurrection, and that they were going to reclaim an election that was stolen. And that's the firm belief and all the people who were part of it. So we've got, tons of material to work with. I think, having seen some of the other stories, you can kind of understand the approach that we're taking. Lots of spreadsheets and lots of watching through the footage and that kind of stuff, and identifying people. It's quite interesting how the Twitter and social media community has really kind of latched onto it and started identifying people, which I don't always like, because you can misidentify people as well, and there's a risk in that. But
well, and there is any mob, type, or lynch mob or witch hunt, sort of thing. And I don't, I'm using those words a little bit facetiously, but I agree with you. Like, I wouldn't like to be the one responsible for identifying someone off a blurry video, on someone's cell phone. So hopefully all of these things will be, double checked and triple checked, and some of the people shared it themselves, or they live streamed, and I think they don't understand that that's not gone. Like, if you put it up there, someone can retrieve that, so the FBI are fairly serious, it looks like, about tracking this down. We had a question on our Facebook page. I'm not sure what it pertains to. He said, any thoughts on changes from the new Biden administration? So this was, to be honest, it came before we were talking about Breonna, so I wonder if it's to do with either like our Russia policy or our foreign policy. I'm not too sure. We didn't really mention about, unless it could have been in reference to, regulating the Facebook and all of these other kind of tech companies.
Oh yeah, there's going to be a lot of pressure on them, I think, to examine that. And who knows what's going to happen.
There seems to be a bit more regulation in Europe, but is that just in terms of advertising as opposed to your privacy? I'm not really sure.
It's GDPR, it's your privacy, and sort of educating and making people aware of like how their surfing of the web can be tracked, and privacy, of ensuring your privacy to your data and that kind of stuff. And also there's jurisdiction, I think, if I'm right, involved in that, and like how data is stored and what jurisdictions it's stored in, and the protections of that data.
I mean, it is incredible to think. I was watching somebody during the week on the news, and they were saying like there was almost 3 or 4 different movements happening last week, because some of them were kind of hapless fools, that were there for the gram and, took photographs foolishly, like with, the speaker's gavel or whatever, or in someone's chair. And then, but then there was a kind of a military type, people who were clearly organized. And then there was just other people who were, stopping the steal. So it's interesting how, this one particular journalist said, like, nobody, Instagrammed when they laid the pipe bombs, so like there is a kind of a serious crowd as well as this other crowd who don't seem to know what they're doing.
Yeah, but there's so many people in the mix there together that you can kind of stitch a lot of it together and see how it's how it's going on. Like yesterday we published a story about the police were really badly beaten there, and I think there's one police officer has lost his eye, another died by suicide afterwards, another might lose their eye, and so there was like really vicious attacks on the police. And I think there are probably efforts to actually, I know there are efforts to try to identify some of the people involved in that.
We had a question again from Mary Beth. Is the data that's being assembled, about where in the US the rioters came from or their age? So like, do we have access, or will you eventually have access to demographic information?
Well, we know that people came from at least 49 states. And so we've got quite a bit of information. Today I was looking at a live stream from Florida, where there were busloads of people getting a briefing from the local law enforcement about how to behave and that kind of stuff. And then in the course of the live stream, they were giving thanks to local politicians who had funded the effort and things like that. So I think there will be people who will be examining funding for it as well, perhaps. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's going to be a lot more that's going to
come out. Yeah, I think so too. Because it was kind of, we saw the same stuff sort of over and over again. But I mean, Washington has to be riddled with, cameras and satellites and all kinds of things that some guy was saying, like how many extra kind of towers to ping off of there are underground, even so that you don't ever lose the signal. So there's really no hope of wiping your data if you were there, I think.
Yeah, and I think there was a conscious effort by different groups to archive it while it was still up, because people obviously a lot of people who are there now realize that they've incriminated themselves, and they've wiped their accounts. And so that was something that has happened. And Facebook then itself took the action to delete any content that was related to it or remove it.
Yeah.
So you could argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing because it impedes investigations. That's an ongoing thing actually with some of the platforms is that they have algorithms that will wipe content that might be evidence of human rights abuses in Syria, for instance, or things like the capital that are of interest to investigators. So it's something we've been talking about for the last 6 years, but the platforms still haven't come up with a way to make that stuff available to the right groups.
And that's we talked about this before we came online, that you guys, particularly things like maybe the Las Vegas shooting or the Breonna Taylor, like sometimes you do want to protect your sources if it's not an open source kind of and so I presume platforms will have the same thing, that if you're committing a crime, the information needs to be made available, but if you're a whistleblower type thing, maybe you need to be protected. So it's how one algorithm won't do that probably. So sorry, Jeff did clarify on Facebook that it was the foreign policy. Do we think there'll be a change? I mean, that's maybe outside of your wheelhouse.
I don't really cover DC politics, but we kind of keep in mind to it, all right, obviously. In relation to Syria or to Russia?
Syria and Russia, probably.
Syria and Russia? Who knows? I mean, I think, when they were talking about whether during the Obama administration, to withdraw troops or to leave them in Afghanistan, I know it's a totally different situation, but Biden was more in line with Trump in trying to bring troops home, and felt that they weren't achieving what they should over there. And Obama went the other direction. So you would probably think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about his new Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, but I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But the reason I say that is that he's less likely to want to get entangled in fresh conflict, but perhaps through sanctions. You never know.
Yeah.
Certainly, the previous administration was very cozy with Russia.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I think that will probably change anyway. That there'll be a pullback, at least. Meg Carroll, one of our board members, has said, thank you for your fascinating talk and for all your stories with all of the thousands of sources. I think I know the answer is that it's not a quick job, but how do you analyze, collate and synthesize so much so quickly? Particularly, you said earlier, you're a small team.
Yeah, just trying to be organized about it and divvy it up in a way that, we're not duplicating effort, I think is probably the biggest thing. And it's not always quick. I mean, serious stuff was 9 months of work. And we were full-time at it, and it was a team of 9 people, 5 core, and then an additional 4 people helping us. So it was a big team, day after day after day after day, working really hard on it, like right up to, like, I left the office at 10:30 New Year's Eve. They really were really committed to it, right through Christmas and everything. So there's that, but then there's some things like, say, the Iran crash, and the plane crash in Iran last year. I mean, that ended up being a 20-minute job, like proving that Iran had taken down that airliner, because over the previous days, even though we were not finding anything that was revealing, we were documenting it, plotting it out on a Google Earth sort of 3D model, showing where the plane signal was lost, where CCTV of a missile launch was fired, even though you couldn't see it hitting the thing, where the plane crashed, the route that the plane had taken as it tried to turn around and reach Tehran airport again. And then this video emerges that's really short. I think it was only 20 seconds or 30 seconds, and it's a vertical video taken in the darkness, and you just see, you hardly see the plane, but you see this light coming up and exploding right at the tip of the plane, and then you see the outline of the plane, a flash, and then you see the plane continuing on fire. And because we had a mind map of all of this, we really quickly realized, okay, it has to be in this area. We narrowed down the corner. Actually, I was doing that while my colleague Christian picked up the phone, got the person who, the kid's gone to bed, got the person who had uploaded it, asked him questions and that kind of stuff. How do you know? What were you doing? Why did you start filming? Oh, I'd heard an explosion just beforehand. And that all tallied with what we had seen. The first explosion knocked off its radar, and we knew that this explosion happened, right along the plane's trajectory, about 20 seconds later at the speed it was going, because you have all of this data available to you. So it's a bit of physics, a bit of Pythagoras theorem, and
Who said we
that
wouldn't
sort of
use it?
stuff. Huh?
Who said we wouldn't use
Who
that?
said we'd never use it? But that kind of stuff, because you see the flash and then you hear the bang, and you're like, okay, well, what distance was that away from the sound? And you can verify it in all sorts of these different ways. And then we very quickly put that up, annotated, and explained why it showed that a missile had taken it down. So that work can happen really quickly when it all comes together. The other stuff can often take months.
Well, and you'd better to be accurate than fast, So, and as we said, there's so many witnesses to things these days. So, does anybody else have a question? I'll just quickly check our Facebook. Andrew said on Facebook that he saw a riveting ISIS story podcast which recently fell apart. How does this compare to false New York Times reporting in the run-up to the Iraq invasion? I'm not sure.
I was one of the people who had to reinvestigate that story.
Yeah.
But
is this the weapons of mass destruction he's talking about? Or, which
I mean, there are parallels. Yeah, I mean, that was the Judith Miller, stories that really kind of took the evidence that government agencies in the US back in 2003 were giving were offering as evidence of weapon WMDs at face value. And published a series of stories on the New York Times, and obviously it all turned out to be bullshit, and that was a major failure in journalistic checks and balances. The recent one was a podcast series called Caliphate, and one of my colleagues, who is a very good reporter, Rukmini Calamachi, there was a person a character in that story who we now believe was lying. There were issues with his story that they discovered in the course of reporting that podcast and confronted him with in one of the episodes. But obviously, those episodes shouldn't have gone out, given the concerns that there were about him, and there were even more concerns when we reinvestigated it over the previous October, November, December. So what was the question? It sounds like I'm trying to dodge.
No, just how does it compare, that podcast that fell apart, how does that compare to the false New York reporting and coming up to the original Iraq invasion? So you kind of
I think they're both failures. One with massive consequences that are still reverberating around the world today, and another one with less consequences, because it was a fairly isolated, it was one character, but still, journalistic failings that the reporters involved admit, shouldn't have happened. And it was, I think, a big learning for the Times institutionally, because it wasn't just the reporters. There wasn't a senior editor with knowledge of this beat assigned to it, because it was a podcast and not a print series or a video series. And so I think that has been a big realization that regardless of the platform, the same level of scrutiny needs to be applied to them. So, yeah.
And I think, we started off the night by saying that journalism in a way is changing, and because of the digital media, but like the work you were doing, my God, there's satellites involved, there's timestamps, there's pinging off of cell towers, there's 7 or 8 ways to verify physically kind of the where people are at, or whether it went or not, aside from photographs and things. And you said that journalistic integrity, journalists are generally held to a standard of accountability. There's a ton of research that has gone into it, that takes a lot longer than a 240 character tweet or someone's blog, in the basement, and that we shouldn't be judging both of them in the same. That, like, most of the time, I think what you read in a reputable news source is actually trustworthy.
Yeah, most of the time, I think, I mean, an incredible amount of work goes into it, and we put a lot of effort into making sure we're on solid ground with with everything we say in a line of script. Like, it might not be evident in the verb that we use in a particular script line, but we're very carefully, we try to wed our stories very carefully to the evidence and to the facts and the factoids and the accumulation of all of that into whatever, analysis that we're presenting. And also, we're just afraid of losing our jobs.
Yeah. Well, and you were working with data. Like, I'm sure there's obviously sometimes a story you want to tell or a conclusion that you want to reach, but obviously, hopefully, you're not.
There isn't actually, and I should say that about the Russia stuff. It's not an agenda against Russia. It's really like destroying healthcare in an area the size of Ulster is like has real profound effects on the population that are there, and shedding a light on that was really our mission, regardless of whether it was Syria or it was Russia doing it, whatever. We do the same stuff with American malfeasance and attacks in Afghanistan. When an American mob torched aid going into Venezuela, we got a lot of pressure from US agencies. Don't run the story, don't fall for this fake news and this disinformation. In fact, it was the Americans that were peddling disinformation. And so there's no sort of pro-government agenda. It's independent. It's like where the facts lead you. And that's the conclusion that you come to.
So are you in New York for good now, do you think, or will you head home at some stage? Home?
I don't know. We'll see. I'd say we'll hopefully get home at some stage.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So you haven't been able to visit because of COVID either? We
came for 2 years and we're here nearly 5 now.
Oh, famous last words.
We couldn't. We would have gone home this year, I think, when things kind of eased off and worked remotely, because our office is closed. I can be working from anywhere, like some of our team are at home in Brazil or at home in Austria. Half of our team are immigrants, actually. But our visa, we didn't get a green card until this year. So our visa precluded us from going home because there was no guarantee, given the restrictions, that we'd get back in. But now I think if things die down in Ireland and ease up and things aren't so bad here, we might think about going home for a couple of months. Let's see.
Well, no one has chatted. Any other questions? And I don't think there's anything else on the Facebook. So Malachy, thank you so much for joining us and for all of the members and friends of the museum who did. I thought it was a very interesting chat, and hopefully, we might have you back at some point. But I know your kids are going to bed now, so hopefully we didn't keep them up late.
Elizabeth, can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
Malachy, I lived in Dublin in 1977-78, and your Uncle Vincent, I had an interview at McGill with your uncle when he was starting the magazine.
Go on, that's gas.
I did not get the job, but I had a great chat with him.
Is that above O'Donoghue's, was it?
I'm trying. No, I think it was in an office somewhere.
Was it?
Really?
Yeah. They had an office above O'Donoghue's for many years.
Okay. So funny.
But it was a great magazine still.
Yeah.
I
know that was great. So I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I love those connections, Meg. It's always such a small world, the 6 degrees in the Irish American community.
I know.
And thanks to everyone who tuned in and for asking questions. And we did live stream it and I recorded it, so I'll probably put it on our YouTube page at some stage, but we'll be in touch, Malachy.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah. I hope you get some sleep.
Yes. Yeah. See you. Good to see you.
Thanks. You too.
Thanks for staying with us. Right.
Not at all. And up the kingdom. And Limerick, we'll give it to you. Bye, guys. Take care, everyone. Happy New Year to you.
Safe. Bye.
Yes, you too. Bye-bye.